afternoon to everybody who may be watching on stream or on YouTube. We've reached section number 23. Its title is Life in Babylon, the Exiles, and the Prophet Ezekiel. Well, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon was a remarkably enlightened conqueror of many people, as well as the Jews.
I can't hear it very well.
That's okay.
I'll just leave it running if that's okay.
I'll be clever. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to session 23, not only to you, but the people who may be watching on stream or on YouTube. We've reached session 23, entitled Life in Babylon and the Prophet Ezekiel. Well, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon was a remarkably enlightened conqueror of many peoples as well as the Jews. He brought all the captured rulers and leading people to live in the various suburbs of Babylon, but instead of treating them like slaves, he employed all these skilled workmen on his many grand building projects and gave them all the freedom to live according to their own customs. What he did not allow, however, was permission for any of them to return to their own homelands. Instead, he invited them all to enjoy all the good things in life that the great cosmopolitan city of Babylon had to offer. Let's remind you of the great cosmopolitan city. Do you remember that lovely, huge blue gate, all covered in blue tiles? The gate, the Ishtar gate of the city of Babylon, and that long processional way that stretched for 3 miles in a straight line across the city. It was fabulous. And Babylon certainly was a fabulous city. It was so exciting, a cosmopolitan city, that with all the attractions one could possibly hope for. There were many festivals emanating from the various temples, with processions, dancing, music, and of these, the weekly festivals of Marduk on Saturdays. They were more elaborate than any others, and yes, there were many attractions to be had in the city. And many of the conquered peoples, including many of the younger Jews, took full advantages of the opportunities that were offered. The wise Nebuchadnezzar had no fear of rebellion in Babylon while he was away elsewhere. And as time went by, many of the newcomers settled quite happily. They raised their families, they prospered, and finally lost any wish to go home. As time went by, many of them, the Jewish people, did the same. And in fact, there was still a healthy community of resident Jews in Babylon, or Baghdad, well into the 20th century, until, I'm afraid, Saddam Hussein eliminated the last of them. There are none there now. Now back to the second exiles. When they arrived from Jerusalem, and spread around the allotted area outside the city centre. Families kept together, priestly families, the aristocrats, commercial pioneers, and various interest groups. Gradually, they became used to their new homes. The children and eventually the grandchildren grew up knowing no other except for the memories of their parents, memories that were passed to each new generation as time went by. One colossal change came about as they lived in Babylon. They began to speak the language of Babylon, called Aramaic. And this made life much easier for all of them, and particularly for those who set up business and began to trade. The long-term result, however, was that their own language, Hebrew, began to become old-fashioned and gradually dropped out of daily use. It became their classical language, as Latin gradually became ours 400 years ago. But when their scholars copied out the old Hebrew texts they had brought with them from Jerusalem, they even developed a more beautiful style of writing with squared letters, which are familiar today. It gives a dignity to their ancient records. There's a slide there of the sort of cuneiform writing that was normal in Babylon. But the old classical language, which was now being beautified, looked much more like that. Not all of the Jews lost their separate identity or forgot their own language and customs. The core groups, which will continue this long story, became more conscious than ever before that they had to work hard to preserve their separate identity. In fact, they had plenty to think about, and especially about their God, Yahweh. The first exiles had felt very cut off from him, and after the temple's destruction in 586, they were bereft, depressed, and very bewildered. In the ancient world, people thought that if their God had been defeated by a conqueror, then he wasn't much good as a god anyway. So they adopted the conqueror's God for their own. And some Jews did just that. They went into the center of Babylon every Saturday and began to enjoy all the exciting, worshipful activities of the god Marduk. So they drop away from this story and just get lost. But the story, however, does continue in the strangest way imaginable. We need to remind ourselves at this point that in moving to Babylon, the Jews were back in the same cultural milieu as Abraham had come from about 1,500 years beforehand. So we're back in that sort of atmosphere. Remember, their ancestor Abraham had come from Ur, further south, with its own city god, the moon god, where their calendar was based on the 13 moon cycles of the year, or months coming from moon, the months of the year, because they had needed its light to move their flocks to new pastures out of the heat of the daylight. Their new moon festivals, therefore, were of the greatest importance to them. Remember also that the people of Ur were in opposition to those who lived in ancient Babylon. The tensions were that the god of Babylon was the god of the sun, and whose calendar was based on a 7-day week and 12 months in a year. And, in addition, Babylon had invented the idea of a Sabbath day once a week, a day when all residents should be free from work to worship the sun god in the city centre. And now, of course, the Sabbath day would create an opportunity for the Jews who couldn't do any trading on that day. Nobody was at work. So they didn't want to go into the city centre activities, so they met together elsewhere, they began to discover how they could preserve their own culture and identity in a foreign land, away from Jerusalem that no longer existed. It can be claimed that this was the beginning of the synagogue meetings. The word synagogue means even today among Jews a meeting place, a meeting together, to talk, to make all sorts of decisions for the community about the things that matter, including business, politics, probably the weather, as well as acknowledging God as their top priority. Well, the second wave of exiles had arrived to hear that a young Jewish priest in Babylon, Ezekiel, had claimed that Yahweh had called him to be a prophet. Yeah, even in Babylon. And the questions began. How could this possibly be? Or could it be true? Had Yahweh called Ezekiel to prophesy? Had Yahweh come with them? And if so, what did that mean? They began to debate such questions together and begin to sing their national songs again, the Psalms as we know them. They reminded themselves of all they knew about their God Yahweh and remembered all that he had done for them since the time of Abraham. Their deliverance from slavery in Egypt, so I don't know why that picture's come up yet. Let's take it back. They reminded themselves of all they knew about their God Yahweh and remembered all that he had done for them since the time of Abraham. There was a deliverance from Egypt and slavery, the covenant they'd made with Moses, and most importantly, their important promise to keep Yahweh's law in return for his promise to be their God forever. Some of them even determined to keep Yahweh's law better than ever before. And indeed, in Babylon, this gradually became the glue that bound them together as a society. Before exploring the new ideas about Yahweh, however, we must take a look at Ezekiel's story. It falls into two parts: before and after the catastrophic events of 586, which I hope is embedded in your memories by now. Before that, though, in the year 591, 6 years after the first exiles had been taken to Babylon, the young man Ezekiel, of one of the priestly families, claimed that he had been called to be a prophet of Yahweh. But no one believed him. He was a priest, not one of those prophets. And besides that, he was talking gibberish. Talking gibberish when he described his calling to them. And we have only to read the first 3 chapters of his book, Ezekiel, to know what they meant. He described seeing a great cloud with a brightness around it and fire flashing forth continually, and in the fire something like gleaming amber. Well, artists from time to time have tried to portray these sort of pictures, tried with great difficulty, I may say. And in the middle of this were 4 living creatures. They were of human form, but each had 4 faces. Each one of them had 4 wings. They had, in fact, the face of a human being, the face of a lion, that was on the right side, the face of an ox on the left, and the face of an eagle on the 4th side. Then, after a similar bewildering description of their wings and wheels within wheels, it continues, and I quote, "All under a dome which shone like crystal, accompanied by the sound of many waters, like the thunder of the Almighty, the sound of a tumult, like the sound of an army. And above the throne was something like a throne. Its appearance like sapphire, and seated above the throne was seated something like a human being. Upwards from what appeared like in the loins, I saw something that looked like fire, and there was a splendor all around. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of Yahweh. When I saw it, said Ezekiel, I fell on my face, and I heard the voice of someone speaking. No wonder his family laughed at him. This was nothing like they'd ever heard before, and certainly no prophet had ever had such an extravagant experience of Yahweh. It all sounded like the religious language of Persia, in fact, to the east of Babylon, where the prophet Zoroaster was preaching a new religion. The Jews were not even interested in that. But we shall hear much more of this sort of language in future, for it pervaded much of all religious language in the Middle East and in the area from now on. Some of it appears in the Old Testament amongst the post-exilic prophets and in the 2nd century historical novel about Daniel. A lot of that apocalyptic in there. And even later in parts of the early Christian literature, mainly in the book of Revelation, but also in the Gospels. I'm sure you realize Mark chapter 15 is very, very different in style from the rest of the Gospel. It is in the apocalyptic style. It always gives exotic dream pictures of God's glory and imaginatively describes the world from God's point of view, as if he is talking. Well, Ezekiel heard himself addressed as, O mortal, and heard the voice say, I am sending you to the people of Israel, to a nation of rebels, and you shall say to them, Thus says the God Yahweh. And whether they hear or refuse to hear, they shall know that there has been a prophet among them. Ezekiel was told not to be afraid by what people thought, but to keep on repeating Yahweh's words, whether they listened or not. He himself was told to obey, to open his mouth, and eat what he was given. A hand was stretched out before him, holding a written scroll. And chapter 3 begins, He said to me, O mortal, eat what is offered to you. Eat this scroll and go speak to the house of Israel. So I opened my mouth, and he gave me the scroll to eat. Then I ate it, and in my mouth it was as sweet as honey. Well, not surprisingly, Ezekiel was stunned by this experience, and he says he went home and sat exhausted for 7 days. Took him a long time to recover. But he'd been commissioned to speak in the name of Yahweh and was encouraged by another apocalyptic experience, seeing the glory of God in the valley of the river Kibar, where he now lived. Ezekiel was convinced that this was all true, and Yahweh's sphere of influence now included his people in Babylon, though they were far from his temple in Jerusalem. And for the next 5 years, Ezekiel spoke in vain. No one took any notice of him, thinking him totally mad, like an epileptic who had weird trances. We know little of his life story, except that he was one of the elite families among the priests. He was married and had a house of his own. He seems to have known and been influenced by the prophecies of Hosea and later by Jeremiah, with his new teaching that each individual person would be responsible for his own relationship with God. Do you remember that covenant that Jeremiah forecast? With each person with their own heart. And in their heart, they would get to know God. This personal relationship was new. And Ezekiel had obviously heard it and was developing it. He taught it more forcefully, negating the words of the old proverb that the parents have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge, while the traditional ideas of the sins of the fathers would rest upon the children for 3 or 4 generations. Ezekiel taught it's only the person who sins that shall die. And he taught them that when individually the wicked turn away from their wickedness to what is lawful and right, each will save his life. He advised everyone then to get a new heart and a new relationship with God, a new spirit, because Yahweh takes no delight at all in the death of any of them. In chapter 23, he preached in agony about the coming destruction of the temple and the city of Jerusalem. And in chapter 24, he writes, "In the 9th year, in the 10th month, the word of Yahweh came to me, saying, 'Mortal, write down the name of this day, this very day. The king of Babylon has laid siege to the city of Jerusalem this very day.'" Well, his distress was so intense that he couldn't even mourn for his wife when she died. The delight of his eyes, he called her. When she died, this was to be a lesson for the others, when the news eventually arrived of the disaster of 586. It's recorded in chapter 33, again, in this ponderous language, "In the 12th year of our exile, in the 10th month, and on the 5th day of the month, someone who had escaped from Jerusalem arrived and said to me, 'The city has fallen.'" And Ezekiel's life changed. People started to take him more seriously. Well, at long last. But the whole character of his teaching now changed. It's now become very positive, focusing on the future with enthusiasm. In chapter 34, in the name of Yahweh, he spoke of all the leaders of Israel, calling them Yahweh's shepherds, like Abraham and King David. But he denounced the shepherds whose selfishness had led them all astray. And I quote from chapter 34, "Thus says Yahweh, our God, I myself will search for my sheep and seek them out. I will rescue them, and I will bring them into their own land. I myself will be the shepherd of my sheep, and I will seek the lost and bring back the strayed. I will bind up the injured and strengthen the weak. But the fat and the strong I will destroy. But I will feed them with justice. And as for you, my flock, says Yahweh our God, I will judge between the sheep and the sheep, between rams and goats. I will set up over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he shall feed them and be their shepherd. I, Yahweh, have spoken. Well, now people were listening to him and were cheered, knowing for certain that Yahweh had somehow not abandoned them, but was already planning their rescue and restoration back to their own land. But Ezekiel's prophecy continued. He had a vision, the vision of the valley of dry bones. But let's go on. The valley of dry bones. And he prophesied that all the dried bones would come to life again. Quote, "So I prophesied as I had been commanded, and suddenly there was a noise, a rattling, and the bones came together, bone to bone. And I looked, and there were sinews on them. Then flesh had come upon them, and skin had covered them, but there was no breath in them. But then I prophesied as I was commanded, and the breath came into them, and they lived. And Yahweh said to me, 'Mortal, these bones are the whole house of Israel. O my people, I will put my spirit within you, and you shall live, and I will place you on your own soil. Then you shall know that I, Yahweh, have spoken, and I will act, says Yahweh.'" The last chapters on the long scroll of Ezekiel read like an architect's plan for the rebuilding of the temple when they got back to Jerusalem. It was nostalgically as they had remembered it, and the re-establishing of the priestly sacrificial rites they hoped would go back. Yes, Ezekiel was a true prophet of Yahweh, and he, Yahweh, was still wonderfully in control. Thus it was that the exiles began to realize that Yahweh's jurisdiction was much bigger than they had ever thought before. He was not confined to one building in the temple, even if that had been his home among them. He had met them originally at Mount Sinai, and now had traveled with them to Babylon. He was still their God, and they were still his people. And thus it was that the Jews started work among themselves in a new and very different way than ever before. During the next 40 to 50 years, and that's a long time, and over several generations, they began to collect together all the information about themselves that mattered for the future. Families began to codify their ancestors and produce their family trees. The priestly groups made deliberate efforts to collect together all their ancient liturgies and prayers, like the harvest prayer built into Deuteronomy, "A wandering Aramean was my father." You probably know it. And then, of course, the things like the ancient blessing in the book of Numbers. "The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you." Lovely liturgies which we still use today. And together with all their sacrificial rites and regulations, now bedded into what we call the Code of Holiness, the central chapters of the book of Leviticus. Well, the educated lawyers and secretaries worked together. They gathered together all their historical records, the ancient J and E codes, the stories of Joshua and the conquest of Canaan, the judges, the stories of the kings, Saul and David, the capture of Jerusalem, the records of the two separate kingdoms of the north and the south, the destruction of Samaria, and the discovery of the book in the temple. They examined all of them, sorted them out, and pronounced their Deuteronomic verdict on them all, particularly on the kings of the north, who had all sinned according to the sin of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, he who had set up 2 Yahweh shrines at Dan and Bethel, that is, not in the temple at Jerusalem. The musicians and the singers began to collect all their known and remembered songs, the Psalms. The wisdom teachers collected together all their teaching proverbs, and the descendants of the various prophetic groups mused and meditated on all they had learned from their heroes. All was committed to writing in beautiful Hebrew script and scrolls designed for posterity. Just look. I don't think you can see, but the writing is in columns, as all Jewish scrolls are, so that as they gradually unrolled them, they just had a block, a column of writing, and then they could roll it up and unroll the next bit. It helped to preserve the scrolls that way. For convenience sake, these exilic groups are called schools, that's in inverted commas, by all the people who study them. It's the easiest way to describe them. They learnt from their traditions, and they thought about them, wrote about them, and taught them. So schools. But each one had their own particular emphasis. The School of Amos, School of Hosea, School of Isaiah, School of Jeremiah, and so on and so forth. They all had their own emphases, and therefore we find lots of variations and even contradictions. The interest of the Jews in collecting stories from the ancient past was a popular royal interest as well. King Nebuchadnezzar supported his historians, who were collecting not only events of the past, but also the most ancient of stories that existed, particularly the stories of their own area. And we call these stories myths, spelled M-Y-T-H-S. For example, the story of Enuma Elish. I've got a picture of it. 7 scraps of tablet written in cuneiform, which the scholars have put together and found this complete story of Enuma Elish. It's the story of a huge battle amongst the gods, which Marduk won. And from his winning, he began to create the whole of the earth. Lovely story. And then there's another one. The story of Gilgamesh. Again, written in cuneiform, and this time we find it in columns. And this is the biggest scrap that has been found of that story. But it's the story of the great flood and all the animals who survived the flood. Again, we're going to recognize it in a minute. They're not historically true, these stories, but they're packed full of truth. And full of truth to explain our human condition, how we find life as it is. For example, the story of Adam and Eve and the snake is not historically true because snakes do not talk our language. But the story does contain our human ability to make choices and the consequences, of course, of those choices. The Jews also inherited these stories, but rebuilt them as stories of Yahweh, of creation, and of God. Yahweh made it. of Adam and Eve, the first people he created, and Noah and his ark, who was saved from the great flood, and so on and so forth. But of all these groups, the most creative was the priestly scholars, unable to function as priests in exile, without their temple. Their efforts resulted in the origins of what we call the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, all began to formulate in this positive, productive time in exile. They ascribed the whole 5 books to Moses, and so we've inherited that ever since. They ascribed them to Moses himself as being of paramount importance. They're written in their own style of the 6th century, the century of the exile, except when they are incorporating existing items like the J and the E codes. They're quoted almost verbatim. But throughout, Yahweh is the central character, ever to be worshipped because of his unfathomable holiness. Well, while this was all going on, and so with life in Babylon, the glory of Nebuchadnezzar's city did not last long after his death in 562. And during the 7 years after that, 3 different kings succeeded him, were deposed, or even murdered. The last one was Nabonidus. He seized the throne, being a soldier, and he became the very last king of Babylon. Not Belshazzar, I'm afraid. He was Nabonidus' son, and only ever known as Prince Belshazzar. But while all this was going on, so was life in Babylon. The glory of Nebuchadnezzar's city, I'm afraid, didn't last long after his death. And during the next 7 years, we find that the Jews were inspired to hope that when this was all over, somehow, at long last, their exilic situation would somehow come to an end. Well, it certainly did, and we shall explore that next time when we meet. And that will be bringing part 2 of this long story to its end, and it will be the high point of Old Testament theology with King Cyrus and the arrival of Persia. It's going to be a big story next time, so I hope you'll all come and enjoy it. Thank you for coming today. See you next time. Goodbye.